The fluorescent lights of the quick stop hummed their familiar tune, casting everything in that pale, washed-out glow that made 2 in the morning feel like the loneliest hour on earth. Calvin Price sat behind the counter on a stool that had lost its padding years ago, flipping through a paperback novel he'd already read twice, waiting for the night to end. He'd worked the graveyard shift for almost 4 years now, ever since his mother's diagnosis had forced him to drop out of community college and find something that paid steady, even if it didn't pay much. The hours were brutal, the work was mind-numbing, and the customers ranged from truckers who barely looked at him to drunks who wanted to argue about cigarette prices. But it was reliable. It kept the lights on in the small house he shared with his mother, kept her medications filled, kept food on the table. That was enough. It had to be enough. The quick stop sat at the intersection of Route 60 and a county road that led to nowhere anyone wanted to go. It was the last gas station for 30 miles in either direction, which meant it got traffic from truckers and travelers who had no other choice. During the day, there was usually a steady stream of customers. At night, Calvin was lucky to see a dozen people between midnight and 6. Tonight had been slower than usual. He'd had exactly 4 customers since his shift started: a trucker who bought diesel and a pack of gum, a woman in a minivan who used the bathroom and left without buying anything, and 2 teenagers who'd wandered in around 1:30, clearly high, giggling at the energy drink display before purchasing a bag of chips and stumbling back out into the darkness. Calvin checked the clock. 2:17 a.m., almost 4 hours until his relief showed up. He turned back to his book, trying to find his place, when the rumble of an engine cut through the silence. It was a distinctive sound, not a car or a truck, but something deeper, more rhythmic, a motorcycle. Calvin looked up as headlights swept across the parking lot, and a single bike pulled up to the pumps. The rider dismounted slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been pushed past its limits. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a gray beard that reached his chest and arms covered in tattoos that disappeared beneath the sleeves of his leather vest. His jeans were dusty, his boots scuffed, and even from inside the store, Calvin could see the exhaustion in the way he stood, slightly hunched, like he was carrying something heavy that no one else could see. The man walked to the pump and reached for the nozzle, then stopped. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the machine, his hand frozen in midair. Then his shoulders slumped, and he walked toward the store. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Up close, he looked even more worn than he had from a distance. His face was weathered, deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth, and there was a darkness in his gaze that spoke of long roads and longer nights. "Evening," Calvin said, setting down his book. "Evening." The man's voice was rough, like gravel being poured into a bucket. He stood in the doorway for a moment, glancing around the empty store before approaching the counter. "I've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where my wallet's somewhere on I-40, probably in the back of some trucker's cab, and I've got an empty tank and no way to fill it." The man's jaw tightened, embarrassment flickering across his features. "I'm not asking for a handout. I need to figure out what to do." Calvin studied him. 4 years of working the graveyard shift had taught him to read people quickly, to spot the scammers and the con artists, the drunks who might cause trouble, the desperate souls who just needed a moment of kindness. This man wasn't running a con. He was just stranded, broke, and too proud to beg. "Where are you headed?" "Amarillo. Got family there. Was supposed to be there yesterday, but..." The man stopped, his expression closing off. "Doesn't matter. Point is, I'm stuck. No money, no phone. That was in the wallet, too. And the nearest town is 30 miles back the way I came." Calvin thought about his own situation. He had $23 in his wallet, his lunch money for the next week, carefully budgeted down to the last cent. His mother's medications were paid up through the end of the month, but the electric bill was due on Friday, and he still needed to buy groceries. Every dollar was accounted for. There was no margin for error, no cushion for unexpected expenses. But he also thought about his mother, who had worked 2 jobs for most of his childhood to keep a roof over their heads. She'd taught him that money was important, but kindness was more important, that you couldn't take your bank balance with you when you died, but you could take the way you'd treated people. "How much do you need to get to Amarillo?" The man blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not asking you to..." "I know you're not. I'm offering." Calvin pulled his wallet from his back pocket and opened it. $23. He pulled out a 10 and held it across the counter. This should get you enough gas to make it. It's not much, but it's what I can spare." The man stared at the bill like it was something foreign, something he didn't quite understand. "Son, I can't take your money. You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. I know you're stranded and tired, and you've got family waiting for you in Amarillo." Calvan pushed the bill a little closer. "That's enough. I could be anyone. I could be—" The man gestured at his leather vest, at the patches sewn onto the front. "You know what these mean. You know what people think when they see someone dressed like me? I know what people think. I also know that what people think isn't always what's true." Calvin met the man's eyes steadily. "You're not anyone. You're someone who needs help, and I can help. So take it." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a truck passing on the highway. Calvin watched the battle play out on the man's face, pride against need, suspicion against hope. Finally, the man reached out and took the bill. His fingers were rough, calloused, the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with them. "What's your name, son?" Calvin Price." "I'm Wyatt. People call me Ghost." He tucked the bill into his vest pocket with a care that suggested it was worth far more than its face value. "I'm going to pay you back, Calvin. I don't know when, but I will. I swear it." "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Wyatt's voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "A man pays his debts. That's how I was raised. That's how I live." He held out his hand, and Calvan shook it. The grip was strong but not crushing, the handshake of someone who meant what he said. "Thank you for seeing me when most people would have looked the other way." He turned and walked back out into the night. Calvan watched through the window as he pumped his gas, $9.87 worth, leaving 13 cents change that he left on top of the pump like an offering, then mounted his bike and kicked the engine to life. The rumble filled the empty parking lot, echoing off the concrete in the darkness. Wyatt raised a hand in farewell, and then he was gone, his taillight disappearing down Route 60 toward Amarillo and whatever waited for him there. Calvan sat back down on his uncomfortable stool and picked up his book. $13 left, less than he'd planned, more than he could afford to give away. His mother would scold him if she knew, not for being kind, but for not being careful. But something about the exchange lingered with him as the night wore on. The way Wyatt had looked at that $10 bill, the way he'd said, "I swear it," the weight of a handshake that felt like a contract signed in something more binding than ink. Calvin didn't expect to see Wyatt again. People passed through the quick stop every day, travelers on their way to somewhere else, their lives intersecting with his for a moment before diverging forever. That was the nature of a gas station on a highway to nowhere, but he found himself hoping, in a small and quiet way, that this time would be different. The rest of his shift passed without incident. A few more truckers, a family in an RV looking for the bathroom, a local cop who stopped in for coffee and complained about the cold. Calvan smiled and made small talk and counted down the hours until 6 o'clock. When his relief finally arrived, a college kid named Derek, who always looked half asleep, Calvan grabbed his jacket and headed out to his car. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the horizon in shades of pink and orange, and the air had that crisp, clean smell that only existed in the moments before the world fully woke up. He drove home through empty streets, past houses where families were starting their days, past the elementary school where he'd once been a student, past the hospital where his mother had spent 3 weeks last spring while they figured out why she couldn't stop coughing. The house was quiet when he got there. His mother was still asleep. She slept a lot these days, her body conserving energy for the fight it was waging inside her, and Calvin moved through the rooms with practiced silence. He made himself a sandwich, checked the mail, paid the electric bill online with money he'd have to make up somehow. Then he went to bed, pulling the curtains closed against the morning light, and fell asleep with the memory of a stranger's handshake still warm against his palm. 3 weeks passed. Calvin didn't think about Wyatt much, in the way you don't think about a dream once you've woken up and returned to the demands of real life. There were shifts to work and bills to pay, and his mother's good days and bad days to navigate. The $10 became a line item in his mental ledger, a small sacrifice that had probably been forgotten by the man who'd received it. Until the Tuesday afternoon when the motorcycles came, Calvin was working a rare day shift, covering for Derek, who'd called in sick when he heard the rumble. Not one engine this time, but dozens, a rolling thunder that made the windows vibrate and the energy drinks shiver on their shelves. He went to the door and looked out. The parking lot was filling with motorcycles. They poured in from Route 60 in a wave of chrome and leather, more than Calvin could count, their riders dismounting in a coordinated flow that suggested practice and purpose. Within minutes, every parking space was taken, and bikes were lining up along the curb, on the grass, anywhere they could find room. Calvin's heart hammered against his ribs. He had no idea what was happening, no idea why an army of bikers had descended on his gas station in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. His hand moved toward the phone beneath the counter, ready to call 911 if things went bad. And then he saw Wyatt. The older man was walking toward the store, leading a procession of riders like a general at the head of an army. He looked different than he had 3 weeks ago, cleaner, rested, the darkness in his eyes replaced by something brighter. He was smiling. Calvin stepped outside, his legs unsteady, and met Wyatt at the edge of the parking lot. "What?" His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What is this?" Wyatt stopped in front of him, still smiling, and reached into his vest. He pulled out a $10 bill, crisp and new, like it had just come from the bank, and held it out. "I told you I'd pay you back," he said. "I always keep my word." Calvin took the bill automatically, his brain struggling to process what was happening. "You brought all these people to pay me back $10? "I brought all these people because $10 isn't what you gave me." Wyatt's voice dropped, becoming serious. "You gave me hope. You gave me faith in people. You looked at a stranger in the middle of the night, a stranger who looked like trouble, who most people would have turned away, and you helped, without asking for anything in return." He turned and gestured at the crowd behind him, 50, 60, maybe more riders, all of them watching with expressions that ranged from curious to moved. "These are my brothers and sisters, the Iron Reapers, and when I told them what you did, they wanted to meet the man who reminded me that kindness still exists." Wyatt's smile returned. "So here we are." Calvin looked at the bikers, at the motorcycles, at the $10 bill in his hand. His mind was completely blank. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." Wyatt clapped him on the shoulder. "But you might want to clear some space in there, because we're about to buy a lot of gas, and snacks, and whatever else you've got." He turned and walked back toward the crowd, already giving instructions, already organizing the chaos into something purposeful. And Calvin stood in the parking lot of the Quick Stop, holding a $10 bill and watching as his ordinary Tuesday became something else entirely. Something that felt impossibly like the beginning of a story he'd never expected to be part of. The next 2 hours were the busiest the Quick Stop had seen in years. The Iron Reapers moved through the store like a coordinated storm, filling their arms with snacks and drinks, lining up at the pumps to top off their tanks. They were polite to a fault, saying please and thank you, cleaning up after themselves, making room for the handful of regular customers who wandered in and stared at the sea of leather with undisguised amazement. Calvin worked the register in a daze, ringing up purchases that kept coming, watching the numbers climb on the till. Energy drinks and beef jerky, cigarettes and candy bars, bottled water by the case. One woman, silver-haired and stern-faced with a vest covered in patches, bought every bag of trail mix on the shelf and winked at him when he asked if she was sure. "Road food," she said. "Never know when you'll need it." Wyatt stayed close, helping manage the flow of customers, occasionally stepping behind the counter to bag purchases when Calvin fell behind. He moved with an easy authority that the other riders clearly respected, directing traffic and answering questions and keeping the chaos from tipping into disorder. "You run a tight ship here," Wyatt said during a brief lull, leaning against the counter beside Calvin. "Place is small, but it's clean, well stocked. You take pride in it." "It's just a job." Calvin shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. "I show up, I do the work, nothing special." "That's where you're wrong." Wyatt's eyes were steady on his face. "Showing up is special. Doing the work is special. Most people phone it in, do the minimum, wait for the clock to run out. You're different. I could see it the night we met, the way you kept this place running at 2 a.m, all by yourself, like it mattered." Calvin didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of his job as anything more than a necessity, a way to pay the bills, to keep his mother alive, to survive until something better came along. The idea that it might be something to take pride in had never occurred to him. "How's your mom?" The question caught Calvin off guard. "What? Your mom? You mentioned her that night. Said something about working the night shift because of her situation." Wyatt's voice was gentle. I've got a good memory for details. Comes with the territory. Calvin felt his throat tighten. He didn't talk about his mother with anyone. Not his co-workers, not the few friends he'd managed to keep from high school, certainly not strangers he'd met once at 2 a.m. But something about Wyatt's presence made him want to talk, made him feel like it was safe. She's got cancer, he said quietly. Lung cancer. Stage 3 when they caught it, which was almost 2 years ago. She's been doing treatment, and it's helping, but he stopped, the words catching in his chest. It's expensive and tiring, and some days I don't know if we're winning or just delaying. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Outside, engines rumbled as more riders topped off their tanks. Inside, the store had emptied temporarily, giving them a pocket of privacy. My wife had cancer, Wyatt said. Ovarian. Took her 6 years ago, after a fight that lasted almost 3. His voice was steady, but Calvin could hear the weight beneath it. Those years were the hardest of my life. Watching someone you love get weaker, doing everything you can and knowing it might not be enough, feeling guilty every time you smile or laugh or forget for just 1 second that the world is falling apart. Calvin nodded. He knew exactly what Wyatt was describing. But here's what I learned. Wyatt turned to face him fully. The fight isn't about winning or losing. It's about showing up every day, being there for the good moments and the bad ones, letting the person you love know that they're not alone, that someone's standing beside them no matter what happens. He paused. That's what you're doing for your mother, and that's worth more than any medicine or treatment. That's love, real love, the kind that doesn't quit. Calvin felt the tears threatening and blinked them back. He was at work. He couldn't fall apart at work. I'm sorry about your wife, he managed. Me too, every day. Wyatt's expression softened. But she taught me something before she went. She said that grief isn't the opposite of love. It's the proof of it. The more it hurts when they're gone, the more you loved them when they were here. And that's not something to be sorry about. That's something to be grateful for. The door chimed, and a group of riders came in looking for the bathroom. The moment broke, and Calvin returned to his work, ringing up purchases and making change, the routine of the job providing a structure he desperately needed. But Wyatt's words stayed with him, lodged somewhere in his chest, next to the fear and the exhaustion, and the constant gnawing worry about what would happen next. Around 4 o'clock, the crowd began to thin. Riders were mounting up and pulling out, engines roaring to life in staggered waves, hands raised in farewell as they rejoined Route 60. Calvin stood in the doorway and watched them go, marveling at the transformation of his ordinary afternoon into something extraordinary. Wyatt was one of the last to leave. He stood beside his motorcycle, a massive Harley, black and chrome, gleaming like it had just been polished, and looked at Calvin with an expression that was part gratitude, part assessment. I've got something for you, he said. Before I go. He reached into the saddlebag on his bike and pulled out an envelope, thick, bulging, held closed with a rubber band. He held it out to Calvin. What is this? Open it. Calvin slid off the rubber band and lifted the flap. Inside was money, cash, mostly 20s and 50s, along with a few personal checks. He didn't count it, but he could tell from the thickness that it was a lot. More than a lot. Wyatt, I can't. You can. Wyatt's voice was firm. The club took up a collection. Everyone contributed. Didn't matter how much. When I told them about you, about your mom, about the night shift, and the $10 you couldn't afford to give, he shook his head. They wanted to help, all of them. This is what we do, Calvin. We take care of our own. But I'm not one of your own. I'm just a gas station clerk. You're a man who helped a stranger when you had every reason not to. That makes you family. Wyatt stepped closer and pressed the envelope into Calvin's hands. Use it for your mother's treatment. Use it for the bills. Use it however you need to. No strings attached, no expectations, just a gift from people who believe that kindness should be rewarded. Calvin looked down at the envelope, then back at Wyatt. His vision was blurring again, the tears he'd been holding back finally breaking free. I don't know how to thank you. You already did. 3 weeks ago, at 2 a.m, when you saw a tired old biker and decided he was worth helping. Wyatt mounted his motorcycle, settling into the seat with the easy grace of decades of practice. Take care of yourself, Calvin. Take care of your mother. And if you ever need anything at all, you call this number. He handed over a card, plain white, with a phone number and the words Iron Reapers MC printed in simple black letters. "We ride through here about 4 times a year," Wyatt continued. "From now on, this is an official stop. The boys will need gas and snacks, and they'll need someone trustworthy to provide them. That someone is you." He started the engine, the rumble filling the parking lot. "See you in a few months, Calvin." He pulled out of the lot and onto Route 60, joining the last stragglers of the convoy heading west. Calvin watched until every bike had disappeared over the horizon, until the sound of engines had faded to nothing, until he was alone again in the parking lot of the quick stop. He looked down at the envelope in his hands, opened it again, started to count. $3,427. His knees buckled. He sat down on the curb, right there in the parking lot, and let himself cry, really cry, for the first time in months. The tears came in waves, carrying with them all the fear and exhaustion and hopelessness he'd been carrying for so long. But they also carried something else, something lighter, something that felt like relief. When he finally collected himself, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He wiped his face, tucked the envelope into his jacket, and went back inside to finish his shift. Derek arrived at 6, looking less sleepy than usual, and Calvin handed over the register with a normalcy that felt surreal. "Quiet day?" Derek asked. Calvin thought about the 60 motorcycles, the hours of chaos, the envelope full of money currently pressed against his chest. "Yeah," he said. "Pretty quiet." He drove home through the gathering dusk, his mind racing with everything that had happened. The money changed things, changed everything. His mother's next round of treatment was paid for. The bills could be caught up. They could breathe, for the first time in 2 years. But it wasn't the money that kept replaying in his head as he pulled into his driveway. It was Wyatt's words, about showing up, about love being proved by grief, about kindness being rewarded. His mother was awake when he came in, sitting in her recliner with a cup of tea and a book. She looked tired. She always looked tired now, but she smiled when she saw him. "You're home early." "Covered for Derek, day shift." Calvin sat down on the couch across from her, the envelope still hidden in his jacket. "Mom, something happened today. Something good." He told her the story. All of it, from the beginning. The night 3 weeks ago. The stranger with the empty tank. The $10 he'd given away without thinking. Then today. The motorcycles. The crowd. The envelope now sitting on the coffee table between them. His mother listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached for the envelope and opened it, her thin fingers sorting through the bills with trembling care. "Calvin," her voice was barely a whisper, This is thousands of dollars. 3,427. He'd counted twice. "You gave a stranger $10 and he came back with this?" He said it wasn't about the money. He said it was about seeing him, treating him like a person when most people would have turned him away. Calvin leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He said kindness should be rewarded. His mother was quiet for a long moment, looking at the money, then at her son, then back at the money. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Your father used to say something similar. He said that the world was full of people waiting to be kind. They just needed permission. Someone to go first. Someone to show them it was safe." She set down the envelope and reached for Calvin's hand. "You were that person, sweetheart. You showed them it was safe." Calvin squeezed her hand, feeling the fragility of her bones, the paper-thin skin that bruised at the slightest pressure. She was dying. He knew that, had known it for months, even as he refused to admit it. But she was still here, still fighting, still showing up. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby." She smiled, and for a moment, she looked like she had before the cancer, before the treatments, before everything had gotten so hard. "Now let's figure out what to do with all this money. Your father would have said we should give half of it away." Calvin laughed, the sound surprising him. "He would have said that. He was a fool sometimes, but he wasn't wrong." She squeezed his hand one more time, then released it and reached for her tea. "We'll keep what we need, and we'll pass the rest along. Keep the chain going." Calvin looked at his mother, this brave, stubborn, impossibly strong woman who had raised him alone and taught him everything he knew about kindness, and nodded. "Keep the chain going," he repeated. It sounded like a promise. It felt like one, too. They kept $1,500, enough to pay off the back bills, cover the next round of treatment, and put a small cushion in savings for the emergencies that always seemed to come. The rest, almost $2,000 they set aside, waiting for the right moment to pass it along. That moment came 3 weeks later. Calvin was working the night shift again, back to his usual rhythm of empty hours and fluorescent hum, when a woman came in around midnight. She was young, maybe early 20s, with dark circles under her eyes and a baby on her hip. The baby was fussing, making those thin, unhappy sounds that meant hunger or exhaustion or both. The woman walked through the aisles slowly, picking things up and putting them back down. Formula, diapers, a package of crackers. She kept checking the prices, her lips moving silently, her free hand clutching a small wallet that looked nearly empty. Calvin watched her from behind the counter, remembering. When she finally approached the register, she had 3 items: a small can of formula, a package of off-brand diapers, and a bottle of water. Her hands shook as she counted out the bills, 1s and 5s, smoothed flat from being handled too many times. That'll be 14. 67, Calvin said. The woman's face crumpled. She looked at the money in her hand, $12, maybe 13, and then at the items on the counter. Calvin could see her making the calculation, trying to figure out what she could do without. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I had enough. Can you take the water off? I don't really need it." Calvin looked at her, at the baby on her hip still fussing, tugging at her shirt, at the desperation in her eyes, the exhaustion that went deeper than one sleepless night. "Tell you what," he said, "this one's on me." He reached under the counter where he kept a small envelope of cash, money from the fund he and his mother had created, waiting for exactly this moment. He pulled out a 20 and added it to the register, covering the cost of her purchases, and then some. "What?" The woman stared at him. "I can't. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." Calvin bagged her items and pushed them across the counter. "Someone helped me once when I needed it. Now I'm helping you. That's how it works." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the bag against her chest, her baby finally quieting, and looked at Calvin like he'd just performed a miracle. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much. Take care of yourself and that little one." Calvin smiled. "And if you ever get the chance, help someone else. Keep the chain going." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and hurried out into the night. Calvin watched her taillights disappear down Route 60, then turned back to his empty store and his paperback novel. But he didn't read. He just sat there, feeling the quiet satisfaction of something completed, a circle closed, a debt repaid to a universe that had been unexpectedly generous. He told his mother about it the next morning, and she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Your father would be proud," she said. "You think so?" "I know so." She reached out and patted his hand. "He always said that money was just energy. It's not meant to sit still. It's meant to move, to flow, to find the people who need it most. You're learning that now. You're becoming the man he always knew you could be." Calvin didn't know about that. He was still just a gas station clerk, still working the night shift, still struggling to keep his head above water. But something had shifted in him over the past few weeks, a sense of purpose, a feeling that his life meant something beyond survival. The Iron Reapers came back 2 months later, just as Wyatt had promised. Calvin saw them coming from a mile away, the dust cloud first, then the glint of chrome, then the thunder of engines that made the windows rattle. He walked outside to meet them, grinning despite himself, and found Wyatt at the head of the pack. "Calvin." Wyatt dismounted and shook his hand warmly. "Good to see you, brother." "Good to see you too." Calvin looked at the crowd of bikers filling his parking lot. There were more of them this time, 70, maybe 80. "You brought reinforcements." "Word travels. When I told the other chapters about the kid at the quick stop who gave away his last $10, they wanted to meet you." Wyatt's eyes twinkled. "You're famous now, at least in our circles. I'm not sure I want to be famous." "Too late?" Wyatt clapped him on the shoulder. "Now come on. There's some people you should meet." He introduced Calvin to riders from chapters across the Southwest, New Mexico and Arizona, Colorado and Texas. Each one had a story, a reason for riding with the Iron Reapers, a moment in their life when the club had saved them, or they'd saved someone else. They talked about brotherhood and loyalty, about the code that bound them together, about the belief that kindness was a form of strength, and they talked about Calvin. "Ghost hasn't shut up about you since that night," said a woman named Vega, her silver hair pulled back in a braid that reached her waist. "The kid at the gas station, the one who gave away his last $10. You're a legend now." "I'm really not." You are to us." Vega's eyes were serious. "You showed Ghost something he'd forgotten, something we all forget sometimes when the road gets long and the world gets hard, that there are still good people out there, people worth fighting for." She reached into her vest and pulled out a patch, round, embroidered with the Iron Reaper's insignia, a skull with wings wreathed in flames. "This is for you. It's not a membership, that takes years to earn, but it's a symbol. It means you're under our protection. Anyone who sees this knows you're a friend of the club." Calvin took the patch with trembling hands. The stitching was intricate, the colors bold, the weight of it heavier than he expected. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." Vega smiled. "Just keep being who you are. The world needs more people like you." The afternoon unfolded like the last one, hours of purchases and conversations, bikes being fueled and snacks being consumed. Calvin worked the register until his fingers ached, making change and bagging items, answering questions about his life and his mother and the fun they'd created, because word had spread about that too. "Ghost told us about your mom," a young writer named Torres said, leaning against the counter during a quiet moment. "About the cancer, about how you've been taking care of her." "He talks too much," Calvin said, but there was no heat in it. "He talks just enough, and we've been thinking." Torres glanced at the other writers milling around the store. "The club does charity work, fundraisers, benefit rides, that kind of thing. We've got an event coming up next month, a poker run to raise money for veterans, but the boys were thinking, maybe this year we could split the proceeds, half for the vets, half for your mom's treatment." Calvin's throat tightened. "You don't have to do that." "We want to. It's not charity, Calvin. It's family taking care of family." Torres pushed himself off the counter. "Think about it. Talk to your mom. Let us know." He walked away before Calvin could respond, leaving him alone with the weight of the offer settling into his bones. That night, after the last bike had roared off into the sunset and the parking lot was empty again, Calvin sat on the curb and called Wyatt's number. "Calvin?" Wyatt's voice was warm. "Everything okay?" "Torres told me about the poker run, about splitting the proceeds." "Ah, he wasn't supposed to mention that yet. We wanted it to be a surprise. I don't know if I can accept it." Calvin struggled to find the words. "It's too much. You've already done so much. I don't want to be a burden or a project or—" "Stop." Wyatt's voice was gentle but firm. "You're not a burden. You're not a project. You're a brother, and brothers help each other. That's the whole point. But I haven't done anything to deserve. You gave a stranger your last $10 in the middle of the night. You've been taking care of your dying mother for 2 years without complaint. You used the money we gave you to help someone else instead of keeping it all for yourself." Wyatt paused. "That's not nothing, Calvin. That's everything. That's exactly the kind of person we want in our family." Calvin was quiet, staring at the stars that had started to appear in the darkening sky. "My mom's getting worse," he said finally. "The doctors say the treatment's working, but she's tired. So tired. And sometimes I look at her and I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, if all this fighting's worth it, or if I'm just prolonging the inevitable. I asked myself the same thing when my wife was sick." Wyatt's voice was softer now. "Every day, I wondered if I was being selfish, if I was keeping her here for me, instead of letting her go in peace. What did you decide?" "That it wasn't my choice to make. It was hers. And as long as she wanted to fight, I was going to fight with her. Right up until the end." Wyatt exhaled. "Your mother's still fighting, Calvin. She's still here. That means something. It means she's not ready to go yet. And until she is, you stand beside her. You hold her hand. You show up every single day, because that's what love looks like." Calvin felt the tears coming and didn't try to stop them. He sat on the curb of his gas station parking lot, phone pressed to his ear, and let himself cry. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I'm so scared of losing her." "I know. That fear never goes away, not completely, but you learn to carry it. You learn to make room for it alongside everything else, the love, the gratitude, the moments of joy that still happen even in the middle of grief." Wyatt's voice was steady. "You're stronger than you think, Calvin, and you're not alone, not anymore." They talked for another hour, about life and death and everything in between, about Wyatt's wife and Calvin's mother, about the road and the club and the strange, winding path that had brought them together. By the time Calvin hung up, the stars were bright overhead and the air had turned cold. He sat for a while longer, letting the silence settle around him, feeling the weight of the patch in his pocket and the promise it represented. Then he got in his car and drove home, where his mother was waiting with a cup of tea and a smile that still, after everything, had the power to make him feel like the luckiest person in the world. "You're late," she said. "I know. Sorry." He sat down beside her and took her hand. "Mom, I need to tell you something." He told her about the poker run, about the offer to split the proceeds, about Wyatt and the club and the family he'd somehow stumbled into. His mother listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her thin fingers wrapped around his. "Accept it," she said finally. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She squeezed his hand. "This isn't charity, Calvin. This is community. This is people who've seen something good in you and want to support it. That's a gift, not just for us, but for them too. It gives them a chance to be part of something meaningful. Don't take that away from them." Calvin looked at his mother, frail and tired and still, impossibly wise. "Okay," he said. "I'll call Wyatt tomorrow. I'll tell him yes." "Good." She smiled and patted his cheek. "Now go to bed. You have work in the morning." He did. He always did. But for the first time in a long time, the thought didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with hope. The poker run was scheduled for the second Saturday in October, a crisp autumn day when the leaves had just started to turn and the air smelled like wood smoke and possibility. Calvin had never been to a biker event before, had never been to much of anything, really, beyond work and home and the hospital where his mother went for treatments, and he didn't know what to expect. What he found was a family reunion disguised as a fundraiser. The event was held at a campground about 40 miles outside of town, a sprawling property with a main pavilion, a dirt track for exhibitions, and acres of open field where bikes could be parked and riders could mingle. By the time Calvin arrived, driving his mother's old sedan, feeling conspicuously out of place, there were already hundreds of motorcycles lined up in gleaming rows. Wyatt met him at the entrance, grinning like a proud father. "You made it. I almost didn't find the place." Calvin looked around at the crowd, leather vests and bandanas, tattoos and chrome, the constant rumble of engines arriving and departing. "This is a lot. This is family." Wyatt clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on. There's some people who want to meet you." He led Calvin through the crowd, stopping every few feet to introduce him to someone new. There was Marcus, a former Marine who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan and now rode a modified trike. There was Elena, a grandmother of 7, who'd been riding since before Calvin was born. There was a young couple, barely out of their teens, who'd met at an Iron Reapers event 5 years ago and were now expecting their first child. Each of them had a story. Each of them had a reason for being here. And each of them, when they learned who Calvin was, shook his hand with a warmth that made him feel like he belonged. "So you're the $10 kid," Marcus said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Ghost hasn't stopped talking about you for months. I'm starting to think he needs new material." "Nah, he's got the right idea." Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping. "What you did, helping a stranger when you had nothing, that's the whole point. That's why we ride, why we stick together, because the world's hard enough without making it harder on each other." The poker run itself was a complicated affair involving playing cards and checkpoints and rules that Calvin didn't fully understand, but he didn't need to understand it. His job was simpler: to sit at a table near the finish line and accept donations, to thank people for their generosity, to be the face of the cause they were supporting. His mother's face, really. Her fight, her survival. She'd wanted to come, had insisted, in fact, right up until the morning of the event when her body had finally overruled her will. The latest round of treatment had hit her harder than the others, leaving her weak and nauseated, barely able to get out of bed. Calvin had sat with her for an hour before leaving, holding her hand, telling her about the plans for the day. "Take pictures," she'd said, her voice thin but determined. "I want to see everything," he'd promised, and now, as riders streamed past his table with donations clutched in their hands, he snapped photos on his phone, the bikes and the banners, the food tables and the exhibition track, the sea of faces that had gathered to support a woman most of them had never met. The donations piled up, cash and checks mostly, but also gift cards and envelopes with handwritten notes inside. One woman pressed a small gold cross into Calvin's palm and told him it had belonged to her mother, who'd also fought cancer. "For luck," she said, "and for strength." By late afternoon, the table was overflowing, and Calvin had lost count of how much had been raised. Torres appeared around 4 o'clock with a strongbox and a ledger, carefully cataloging each donation with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "You want the preliminary numbers?" he asked. "I'm not sure I can handle it." Torres smiled and told him anyway. $12,347, and we've still got the auction tonight. Calvin sat back in his chair, momentarily stunned. $12,000, more than his mother's next 3 treatments combined, more than he'd made in the past 6 months of night shifts. That can't be right. It's right. Counted it twice. Torres closed the ledger and tucked it under his arm. These people believe in you, Calvin. They believe in what you represent, and they've got deep pockets when it comes to causes they care about. The auction that night raised another $8,000. Items donated by club members and local businesses, a custom leather jacket, a weekend at a lake house, a vintage guitar signed by someone famous, went for prices that made Calvin's head spin. By the time the last bid was called, the total had climbed past $20,000. $20,000 for his mother. Because he'd given a stranger $10 at 2 a.m, Wyatt found him sitting alone behind the pavilion, staring at the stars, trying to process everything that had happened. "You okay?" "I don't know." Calvin shook his head slowly. "This doesn't feel real. None of this feels real." Wyatt sat down beside him on the wooden bench, the leather of his vest creaking. "I know the feeling. When my wife got sick, people came out of the woodwork to help. People I hadn't spoken to in years. People I'd wronged. People who had every reason to turn their backs on me." He paused. "I didn't think I deserved it. I spent months pushing them away, telling myself I could handle it alone. What changed? I realized that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was trust." Wyatt looked at him, his eyes serious. "When you let someone help you, you're telling them that you believe in their goodness. You're giving them a chance to be their best selves. That's not taking. That's giving." Calvin thought about that, about all the times he'd refused help, insisted on carrying burdens alone, worn his self-sufficiency like armor against a world he didn't trust. "I've never been good at accepting help," he admitted. "Neither was I. Still not most days." Wyatt smiled. "But I'm learning. We all are. That's the whole point of family, to carry each other when the load gets too heavy for one person alone." They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the party drifting from the pavilion behind them, laughter and music, the clink of glasses, the rumble of engines, as some riders called it a night and headed home. "There's something else," Wyatt said eventually. "Something I wanted to talk to you about." "What is it?" "The club's been discussing it, and we'd like to make the Quick Stop an official partner. A regular stop on all our rides through the area, with a percentage of sales going into a fund for local families in need." Wyatt turned to face him. "You'd manage the fund, decide who gets help and how much. It would be your program, your vision." Calvin stared at him. "You want me to run a charity?" "I want you to keep doing what you've been doing, helping people, seeing the ones who need it and stepping up." Wyatt's voice was firm. "You've got a gift, Calvin. The same gift that made you give away your last $10 to a stranger. The same gift that made you split the money we gave you with a woman at your register. I've seen a lot of people in my life, and most of them would have kept that cash for themselves. You didn't. That means something." Calvin looked down at his hands. They were the same hands that had pushed a $10 bill across a counter 3 months ago, the same hands that had rung up purchases and bagged groceries and held his mother's fingers when the pain got bad. He hadn't thought of what he did as a gift. He'd just been doing what felt right, what his mother had taught him, what his father, in the years before he died, had shown him through 1,000 small examples. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need." Wyatt stood, brushing off his jeans. "But don't think too long. The world's got a lot of people who need help and not enough people willing to give it. You could be the bridge, Calvin, the one who connects the two." He walked back toward the pavilion, leaving Calvin alone with the stars and the weight of everything he'd been offered. A bridge, a connector, someone who saw the people in need and matched them with the people who could help. It was terrifying. It was also, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, exactly what he'd been looking for, a purpose beyond survival, a reason to keep going that was bigger than himself. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd taken throughout the day, the bikes and the banners, the smiling faces, the table piled high with donations from strangers who'd become something more. He thought about his mother, lying in bed at home, waiting for him to return with stories and pictures and news of how much had been raised. He thought about the woman with the baby, the gold cross pressed into his palm, the way kindness seemed to multiply whenever you gave it away. And he thought about his father, dead now for almost 15 years, but still present in every choice Calvin made, every value he held. The world is full of people waiting to be kind, his mother had said. They just need permission, someone to go first. Calvin had gone first, and now, impossibly, the world was responding. He stood up from the bench, tucked his phone into his pocket, and walked back toward the pavilion. The party was still going, the music still playing, the family he'd somehow stumbled into still celebrating the success of the day. Wyatt saw him coming and raised an eyebrow. That was quick. I don't need to think about it. Calvin took a breath. I'm in. Whatever you need, however I can help, I'm in. Wyatt's face broke into a grin. He pulled Calvin into a hug, brief but fierce, the kind of embrace that said more than words ever could. Welcome to the family, he said, for real this time. And standing there in the glow of the pavilion lights, surrounded by people who'd become something more than strangers, Calvin Price felt, for the first time in his life, like he was exactly where he was, supposed to be. His mother passed away on a Tuesday in December, 3 days before Christmas. It happened quietly, the way she'd always said she wanted. No machines, no hospital, just the two of them in the living room of the house where Calvin had grown up. She'd been sleeping more and more in those final weeks, her body slowly letting go of the fight it had been waging for so long. Calvin had taken leave from the quick stop, spending every hour at her side, reading to her from the books she'd loved, playing the music she'd danced to with his father in the years before everything got hard. On that last morning, she'd opened her eyes and looked at him with a clarity that had been absent for days. Calvin. Her voice was barely a whisper. My beautiful boy. I'm here, Mom. He took her hand, feeling the bones beneath her paper-thin skin. I'm right here. I know. She smiled, that same smile that had carried him through every hard moment of his life. I've always known. She told him she was proud of him. She told him his father was proud too, wherever he was. She told him to keep the chain going, to keep being the person who went first, who showed others it was safe to be kind. And then she closed her eyes and her breathing slowed, and Calvin held her hand as she slipped away from him into whatever came next. He sat with her for a long time afterward. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel, the same clock that had marked the hours of his entire childhood. Outside, snow was falling, the first real snow of the season, blanketing the world in white. He didn't cry. Not yet. The grief was too big for tears, too overwhelming to process. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, pressing down on his heart with a weight that made it hard to breathe. Eventually, he called the hospice nurse, then the funeral home, then Wyatt. I'm sorry, brother. Wyatt's voice was rough with emotion. I'm so sorry. She went peacefully. That's what she wanted. Doesn't make it easier. No. Calvin stared out the window at the falling snow. It doesn't. The funeral was held 4 days later, on the Saturday after Christmas. Calvin had expected a small gathering. His mother had outlived most of her friends, and their family had always been small. But when he arrived at the church, the parking lot was full. Motorcycles, dozens of them, lined up in neat rows despite the cold, their chrome dulled by the gray winter light. And beside the motorcycles, their riders, leather vests over heavy coats, breath fogging in the frigid air, faces solemn with respect. Wyatt met him at the door. You didn't have to... Calvin's voice broke. You didn't have to come, any of you. Yes, we did. Wyatt pulled him into a hug, holding him tight. She was your mother. That makes her our mother, too. Family shows up, Calvin. That's what we do. The service was simple, the way his mother would have wanted. A few hymns, a few readings, a few stories from neighbors who remembered her, from the years before the cancer, when she'd been the woman who brought casseroles to sick friends and organized block parties and never let anyone feel alone. Calvin spoke last. He stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, the neighbors and co-workers, the church members and old friends, the sea of leather-clad bikers who'd driven from 3 states to be there, and told them about his mother. He told them about the nights she'd worked double shifts to keep food on the table, about the way she'd held his hand through his father's funeral when he was 13, staying strong for him even as her own heart was breaking, about the lessons she'd taught him, that kindness was its own reward, that money was just energy meant to flow toward those who needed it, that the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you gave away. She taught me that the world is full of people waiting to be kind, he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. They just need permission. Someone to go first. Someone to show them it's safe. He looked at Wyatt, at Vega, at Torres and Marcus, and all the others who'd become his family over the past months. She was that person for me, and because of her, I've tried to be that person for others. He paused, letting the words settle. That's her legacy. Not the things she owned or the money she saved, but the kindness she planted in everyone she met. The seeds she scattered that are still growing, still blooming, still spreading to people she'll never know. He stepped back from the podium. The church was silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. Then Wyatt stood, and the other bikers stood with him, and they began to clap, slowly at first, then building into something that filled the sanctuary with sound, a standing ovation for his mother, for the woman who'd raised him to be the kind of person who gave away his last $10 to a stranger. Calvin let the tears come then, let the grief wash over him finally, in waves that shook his whole body. And he let his family, his strange, unexpected, leather-clad family, hold him up. The reception was held at the Quick Stop. It had been Wyatt's idea. The gas station was too small for a proper gathering, but they'd set up tables in the parking lot, rented heaters to combat the cold, strung lights along the pumps and the awning. Someone had brought a barbecue grill. Someone else had brought coolers full of food, and by the time the sun set, the Quick Stop had been transformed into something almost magical, a celebration of life in the most unlikely of places. Calvin moved through the crowd in a daze, accepting condolences and hugs, listening to stories about his mother from people who'd known her in ways he hadn't. A former coworker told him about the time she'd stayed late to help a new employee who was struggling. A neighbor recounted how she'd brought soup every day for a month when his wife was bedridden. A biker named Rosa, who'd lost her own mother to cancer years ago, held his hands and told him that the pain would never fully go away, but it would become bearable, would transform eventually into something that felt more like gratitude than grief. She's part of you, Rosa said. Everything she taught you, everything she gave you, it lives on in the choices you make. Every time you help someone, every time you show kindness, she's there. She'll always be there. Around 9 o'clock, when the crowd had thinned and the heaters were fighting a losing battle against the cold, Wyatt found Calvin sitting alone on the curb where he'd sat the day the bikers first came, the same curb where he'd cried over an envelope full of money, where he'd called Wyatt to talk about fear and love and the weight of watching someone you love slip away. "Hell of a day," Wyatt said, sitting down beside him. "Hell of a year. How are you holding up?" Calvin considered the question. His mother was gone. The house would be empty when he got home. The person who'd shaped every part of who he was had left the world, and nothing would ever fill that void. But he wasn't alone. That was the thing. He'd spent most of his life feeling alone, isolated by circumstance, by responsibility, by the weight of carrying burdens no one else could see. And now, impossibly, he had a family, people who showed up, people who cared. "I'm sad," he said honestly. "I'm going to be sad for a long time, but I'm also," he searched for the right word, "grateful for her, for all of you, for the fact that I got to be her son." Wyatt nodded slowly. Grief and gratitude, they go together more often than people realize. "Your wife taught you that." "She did. Took me years to understand it, but she was right." Wyatt looked out at the parking lot, at the bikers saying their goodbyes, at the Quick Stop glowing with fairy lights like something out of a dream. "What are you going to do now?" Calvin thought about the fund they'd created together, the Quick Stop Community Fund, they'd ended up calling it. In the 3 months since the poker run, they'd helped 17 families, a single father whose car had broken down, a grandmother who couldn't afford her prescriptions, a teenager saving for college whose hours had been cut. Small interventions, most of them, a few $100s here, 1,000 there. But each one had made a difference. Each one had kept the chain going. "I'm going to keep going," he said. "Keep working, keep running the fund, keep being the person my mother raised me to be." "And the gas station?" "The gas station stays." Calvin smiled despite himself. "It's where everything started. It's where Wyatt Ghost showed up at 2 a.m. and changed my life. I'm not giving that up." Wyatt laughed, a warm sound that cut through the cold night air. Fair enough. The boys would riot anyway. They've gotten attached to this place. They sat in, comfortable silence, watching the last of the guests drift away. The fairy lights twinkled. The heaters hummed. Somewhere in the distance, an engine rumbled to life. One more rider heading home, carrying the memory of the night with them. She'd be proud of you, Wyatt said eventually. Your mother. She'd be so proud of what you've built. I know. Calvin felt the truth of it settle into his bones. I just wish she could have seen it. She did see it. She saw it every day, in the way you took care of her, in the way you gave away that $10 when you had nothing, in the way you've helped every person who's come through these doors since. Wyatt stood, brushing off his jeans. The seeing doesn't stop just because she's gone, Calvin. She's still watching. She'll always be watching. He offered his hand, and Calvin took it, letting himself be pulled to his feet. Same time next quarter? Wyatt asked. Same time next quarter. They embraced, brief and fierce, and then Wyatt walked to his motorcycle, mounted up, and rode off into the night. Calvin watched until his taillight disappeared round the bend, until the sound of his engine had faded to nothing. Then he turned and walked into the quick stop, his quick stop, the place where a stranger had become a friend, where a $10 loan had become a movement, where the loneliest hours of his life had transformed into something that felt like purpose. He sat down on his stool behind the counter and looked around at the familiar walls, the shelves of snacks and drinks, the humming refrigerator cases, the clock that ticked its steady rhythm above the register. His mother's photo was taped to the side of the monitor now. He'd put it there the day after she'd passed. A picture from before the cancer, when her smile had been bright and her eyes had been full of life. She looked out at him from across the years, and Calvin could almost hear her voice. Keep the chain going, sweetheart. Keep being the one who goes first. I will, Mom, he said to the empty store. I promise. Outside, the snow had started falling again, soft and silent, covering the world in white. The quick stop glowed against the darkness, a beacon on the highway, a place where strangers could find help and weary travelers could find rest. Calvin Price sat behind the counter and waited for whoever might come through the door next. He didn't know who they would be or what they would need, but he knew he would be ready. He would always be ready. That was the gift his mother had given him, the gift of knowing that every person mattered, every kindness counted, every small act of generosity could ripple outward in ways you could never predict. The chain was unbroken. The legacy lived on. And somewhere in the cold December night, a mother's love burned bright, warming the world, one small kindness at a time.